to another episode of Why Can't We Talk About It? My name is Danny.
And I'm Jocelyn.
And today is going to be I don't know, I say this all the time, but it's another interesting episode because the topic today is about procrastination. And I'm sure for any of our listeners just kind of tuning in, procrastination as a word, as a concept, probably makes a lot of sense. However, we're going to be digging into this a little bit deeper because Jocelyn and I actually have, I think, very different ways of looking at procrastination. One, because I know I procrastinate a lot. However, I kind of just found out that Jocelyn does not. So that's new to me. And yeah, go ahead.
I messaged you earlier. I guess I wasn't paying attention to the order of episode ideas, like what was coming up next. And I just checked earlier today and realized that we were going to talk about procrastination today. So I messaged you and said, do you know what we're going to talk about? Because I don't procrastinate. And I mentioned that I have a trip coming up. I'm leaving Friday and I had everything already packed on Sunday night, like this past Sunday night.
Yeah. And when you sent that to me, when you sent that message to me, first of all, I was like, I couldn't really grasp the concept of an anti-procrastinator, just as an idea. And then when you said you actually packed your bags for a trip 5 days in advance, that one kind of like surprised me too, because then I thought about the last time I went on vacation. I'm pretty sure I packed the day of. And,
oh my God.
And like when I think about even big trips, I remember doing one of those like tour bus type things where you travel through like 10 different cities in Europe. I went with my sister and all that stuff. But I remember that it was the day of that I packed my suitcase. Even though we were
Listeners can't see me right now, but my face is in my hands. It's giving me anxiety just thinking about that.
Oh, yeah. So this is why I think it's going to be very interesting because we're going to talk about both. I think what I'm going to have to say is probably going to be anxiety inducing for Jocelyn. And what she's going to have to say is probably going to be something where I'm just like, I don't understand what's happening, but I will try. So to kind of kick things off, I think I'm going to just kind of go a little bit over just like my take on what procrastination is. I'm sure most people hear it a lot. I do know that word is kind of thrown around a lot, but it basically just means that, at least to me, when someone, such as myself, kind of holds off on doing a task. So it's like, I know I have something that I need to do. It's not even necessarily something that I would say like it's something that I want to do. It's like I need to do this thing at some point. And when I think about it, that could be something for, like for work. That could be something for school. I know that happens a lot for school. Or sometimes even just something for like home. Something as simple as like, I need to do laundry, but I'll kind of hold off on that. I'm like, I can kind of do that later. There's clearly something there where it goes, I have a task to do, but I am making the choice to hold off. I think as a idea, when I think about it, especially as someone in a time before I did therapy, I would say that the reason why people procrastinate is because it has something to do with them being a perfectionist. So this would be the idea that I would be someone who goes, I need to make sure whatever I do is done very well, but the task is something that might be kind of difficult, or it may be a big task, a big ask. And just the idea of knowing I need to go do all that, and it's going to be a lot of work, it doesn't feel great. So I'd rather kind of push it and go do something else that I enjoy more.
Or that I know that I can easily get right.
Yes. Easily
as
get
a
right.
perfectionist.
Yeah, as a perfectionist. But for me, I think, at least personally, when it came to procrastination, it's like the alternative typically was something that was just more about entertainment. So this could be like, if I'm thinking all the way back from like as a kid, as a student, or even as an adult, it's like video games, going online, YouTube, Netflix, etc. Or just even more typically just browsing on my phone. That's a big one and an easy one to access, especially in the last few years. That was something where I was just thought, oh, perfectionist was a thing. And so that's where the problem lies. It's like, I just don't want to deal with it because I need to make sure it's done right. But because it's a big task and it's something that maybe it's not that easy to do, there is a bit of this fear that like, oh, what if I can't do it well?
Mm-hmm.
And then so it becomes, if I don't do it, it could never become something that I don't do well because it never got done in the first place. However, I would say that as someone who is now doing therapy, this was definitely a topic I spoke specifically about with my therapist one time. And it is something where when I kind of dived into it, I do think that perfectionist ideals are still there. However, underneath it, it's like, okay, but where does that come from? And it's like, why is there this need that things need to be done, quote unquote, perfectly? I guess when I think about it, I'm like, what exactly is perfection? And so that's a whole different thing, I suppose. And so I would say, yeah, it's like when I kind of dig in a little deeper, I think it had more to do with, I think self-worth was definitely a subject that we kind of came up with, where it's like, if I'm, let's say, somebody who needs something to be perfect, otherwise I can't do it, maybe there's more to it underneath where it's about where I don't necessarily trust myself to be able to do a good job. There's a lot of self-criticism where it's like, it has to be a good job, or like, it could be something where someone will look at it and go, yeah, this is great stuff, Danny. But I would be like, no, I don't think that's that great because I'm too hard on myself and I'm criticizing myself and just self-doubting my own work, doubting a bit of my own self-worth. And of course, this comes from a lot of other stuff, I think, as a kid, where growing up, especially in a household where there was definitely more criticism than support and approval.
Yeah.
So of course, in a previous episode, we talked about childhood emotional neglect. I think this is one of the symptoms that kind of comes up from that. So I know personally for me, when you kind of grow up without much of support, you kind of don't really know when you're actually doing a good job at something. And so when you don't have that meter to kind of measure, like understand, like, hey, this is good stuff. When you don't really have a lot of that, and most of your stuff kind of is more like criticism coming your way, I think you kind of just grow up also criticizing yourself. And so that kind of just spills over to things that happen later in life, and that includes school and for work.
That would make it really hard to get started on things. So I was going to ask that, what kind of things do you typically procrastinate on? Like, is it those deadline-oriented things like schoolwork or projects at work, or is it other things too in your personal life? Is it small things like packing for a trip? You obviously answered that earlier, or like doing the dishes. What kind of things do you procrastinate on? Yeah,
so even with something like packing for a trip, I'll give an example where I go, okay, I know I pack kind of the day of, or, I would say kind of last minute. What used to be a problem with that was I would just kind of have this abstract idea like what I need to pack. I know the gist of things, but in my head, there was no like exact list of things. So what helped a bit with that is, or I guess the problem originally was that there was no actual list of things I knew I needed to pack. So it's like, I'm just going to throw a bunch of stuff at the end and kind of hope for the best. That was kind of like my approach to packing for trips and vacation, which was kind of like this idea like, well, I don't really know what I'm supposed to do or everything I need. So I'm just going to keep pushing that off until I really need to do it. With school, it would be things like assignments, studying for tests. Like I know people who would kind of study kind of along the way, whereas I was somebody who kind of crammed at the end. I remember going to school, this is like university time, where I was driving to the actual exam and I would be looking at my notes.
No. No.
Car.
No. Oh my God.
So when there was a red light, I would just kind of sneak a peek at my notes and be like, okay, did I get this right?
Danny, are you kidding me? I would stop 30 minutes before an exam because I was like, I'm not going to retain anything that I haven't already retained through my time blocking study sessions over the past month. We're so different. I'm so fascinated by this.
Yeah.
Okay, keep going.
So it's interesting because you say something like, you just said like, oh, you knew there's only so much you can retain, right? Whereas my mindset was like, I'll probably remember the last thing I look at. So it's easier to just look at it as I'm closer to my exam time. Which, in hindsight, I was like, that's clearly a horrible way of doing things. But that happened a few times. It's like I just didn't want to study. I knew I should study, but the task for some reason seemed just a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I also remember this concept in my mind where like, okay, I could study now, but that exam is going to be like a few weeks away. I did have this idea where it's like you want to remember most of the things by having it studied closer to the exam. Whereas if I study it like weeks out, oh, I'm just going to be forgetting it. That definitely was a mentality that I had. I actually don't really know where that comes from, but that was definitely how I did things for school assignments and exams. For work, I would say it's more of if it's something that you just kind of do day in, day out and it's easy, yeah, that's no problem. But sometimes you get kind of a new thing come your way, come across your desk, and it's like, oh, like this just sounds like a big project, or this sounds like it's going to take a lot of time and effort. I think when I first get something like that, I think the biggest problem is it's just this abstract concept of what I need to do. And it's just this huge thing in my mind. I'm like, this is a lot of stuff. And even though I eventually will work on it, it's almost like once you start working on it and it becomes like bite-sized pieces of work, then it slowly gets better. But in those situations too, it's only because typically there's some kind of deadline where there is consequences.
Right. Okay.
And that's what kind of, I guess you can say like it lights a fire under my ass to be like, hey, get it done.
Or else.
And at that point, it's like the consequence, I think, is the one that overrides everything else. And so the consequence becomes like, okay, that's the top thing in my mind now. Okay, how do I avoid this consequence? Oh, I got to do the work. And so the consequence overrides the procrastination in those situations. I think that's how it is with deadlines and whether it's for work, school exams, and so forth. Because if I go and think about this podcast, I brought up this idea of this podcast, I believe, to you just in casual conversation, at least, I want to say a few months, or maybe at least a few weeks before you offered to be a co-host with me. I do think that if you had never made that offer, as of today, I still would have sat on this idea and not actually taken any real action on it. And it's even more of a procrastination problem because this is not like there's a consequence or deadline to it. It's purely something that comes from what I feel like doing.
That's what I was going to ask is what about things that you maybe need to do is not the right way of putting it, but what about things that you should do, need to do, could do that would make your life better that don't have a deadline? Like, how has procrastination affected your life in those scenarios?
I guess with those scenarios where it's like there's some kind of want, where it's like, oh, I want to, but again, there's no huge consequence of it. I think procrastination plays a big part because it's like I will kind of sit on it. And typically, for most things, even if I do sit on something, eventually there will be something where it's kind of like, hey, some kind of external, not necessarily consequence, but just something external. Even if it's someone like, hey, Danny, have you been working on something? Have you been doing that? If someone asks, I'd be like, oh, all right, I need to work on that. Okay, let me go do that. Because now there's something additional besides just me. I would say majority of the time, if it's just something where I want to do, where like no one even knows about it, then I probably will just kind of leave it sitting and not really kind of take action on it until, let's say in this case, like you heard about it, I talked about it, and you asked me about it. Or somebody, if it's a friend or family where I speak of a certain topic and then they'll follow up at some point. And then I'm like, okay, well, I've been sitting on it, but thanks for bringing that up. It reminds me I should probably go work on that. I think that's kind of how procrastination is something that kind of affected me for a long time. However, I will say though that I think with therapy help and speaking with my therapist, kind of working through it, and even just today talking about it as a topic, I think it's something where digging deeper will be something that is helpful because I can kind of tell that grasp of wanting to always be distracted and entertained, that grasp has loosened a bit. I'm not saying obviously that I'm like, oh, I'm totally cool with not checking my phone, looking at anything online. But I think there's more times now where I can go, you know what, I'm going to shut that off and go get my laundry done, get my dishes done, go get some exercise done, and just kind of do things that I actually want to get taken care of. So I think that's how I look at that. It's definitely something that's affected me for a long time. And sometimes I do think about how procrastination is a big deal for a lot of people. Not for you, but for a lot of people. It's it's definitely something that I think probably I would say comes from something more than just, oh, they're a perfectionist. I think it's almost like a disservice now when I think about it to say to someone, oh, you're just a perfectionist. That's how you are. I would go, I think there's more to it. Whether or not somebody wants to explore on that, who knows? But I don't think it's as black and white as I used to think of the topic of procrastination as just some kind of quirk that somebody has. There's probably a lot more to it that I think people, if they're listening to this, they hear it and it kind of resonates and they're like, hey, maybe there's something to look into. I think that would be helpful because it definitely is something that is helping me so far.
Yeah, nothing's ever black and white. Everything's gray. I'm so happy to hear that you feel like therapy has been helpful because I think procrastination is one of those things, it's a hard mindset to break. So therapy and recognizing when you're doing it and knowing that you don't need to necessarily get something 100% right or be perfect at it, that's what you find is the most helpful for you, like talking yourself through it if you know it's happening.
Yeah, I think talking through it, thinking through it, and sometimes just kind of questioning the initial thought process.
Okay.
One memory that kind of comes to mind is, and I'm sure a lot of people can kind of relate, is where, I've come from a way of growing up in which, your parents wanted you to do very well in school. That was like the top thing. It's almost like there's an expectation that your marks are going to be high. And so it's almost like if you do really well in school, it's expected. So it's like, okay, cool, you did what's expected. But if you don't get good grades, then it becomes a problem. And I remember that I didn't really like school that much past like grade school. Like high school, I definitely didn't care for it. University, even less, I think. But I remember even for something like, there's one interaction I had with my mom where I came home with I think it was a test mark in high school, and it was for chemistry, which I, in general, did poorly on. But I remember there's one test, for some reason, I did really well. For me, at least. In comparison, I suppose. But I remember I preemptively wanted to kind of not deal with the criticism that was going to come to me because the mark wasn't that high. And I said to my mom, I showed her the mark, and I said to her before she even said anything, I go, I know it doesn't look that great, but actually most people did worse than me. And I think only a couple people did better. And I thought that was like my way out of having some kind of like lecture or criticism come back at me. And my mom's like, well, Danny, you should never really compare yourself to those who do worse than you. You should always compare yourself to those who do better so you can strive to be better like them. I was like, oh, man, that kind of backfired. And that kind of sticks to my head because there was something about this idea, or I guess I kind of internalized when my mom said that, which was, even though I did my best, it's not enough.
Right.
And even if I do my best, there's always going to be people who do better than me. So I can never be satisfied. And I think that may not be the original genesis of it, but I think it's stuff like that where it goes, that kind of leaks into your later life where it's like, oh, it has to be perfect because I'm going to be criticized if it's not.
Yeah, reinforce the message for sure.
Yeah. And so I think that's something where like I can take procrastination today, but if I kind of like really kind of dig in, think about it, go back in my life, I'm like, oh, it kind of comes from somewhere. Maybe there's a personality thing to it, but I do think there's more to it than just that. So yeah, I think that's procrastination from my point of view, which you don't understand.
Well, No, it's not that I don't understand, because everything that you're telling me is it makes so much sense. So I definitely do understand it. I think I just never gave it much thought. I think I thought there are people who procrastinate and there are people who don't. And I didn't necessarily think that procrastination was a bad thing, because I've read studies or not studies, but I've definitely read articles that have mentioned that working under a deadline, like people who can only work under a deadline, that's not necessarily wrong. It actually can produce good results. So I think I just thought it's just different ways of approaching tasks. I didn't think that one was necessarily better than the other, but it really helps me to see the background with your experience, and also your point around how procrastination in things that would be meaningful to you and that don't have a deadline, how that can affect the quality of your life. So I think it is an important topic, and I'm glad that we're digging into it.
Yeah. And so I think, having said all that stuff I just said, my question is, number one, even though you understand it, though, you don't really resonate with it, right? Because you kind of get things done, you do things in advance. The idea of knowing that you need something taken care of, but then consciously holding off, that doesn't really make sense for you, right? For your personal self.
Yeah. So going back to what you said about knowing that there's going to be a consequence lights a fire under your ass, that's your motivation to get it done, right? My motivation for doing things in advance is knowing that I will be less stressed out when that deadline arrives. So this goes back, I don't know, it goes back pretty far. I remember if I would get homework done earlier or ahead of time, that feeling of free time felt so good. It felt so much better than knowing that I had something to do later on. And then that just, I guess, has translated into everything else in my life. I just like knowing that things are done, things are set, things are in order. I'm not going to be stressed out because I'm rushing to get something done. Everything is just going to go smoothly. When it comes to things like my upcoming trip, I think that is really helpful because, for instance, like this week was pretty busy for me. I knew that I had a busy work schedule, and then every day after work, I had a commitment. So I knew that if I left packing until Thursday, where I have French class after work, and it's a really long day, I probably wouldn't pack correctly, and then I'd be forgetting something, or I would be stressed out. So it's very helpful for me to get things done ahead of time. So the motivation for me isn't like there's a deadline looming and if I don't do this, then I'm going to get into trouble or something like that. It's more like I'm getting this done so that I can set myself up to not have a meltdown.
It kind of sounds like you can kind of foresee the amount of stress that you're going to be in if you leave things. And you're like, you just rather not have to go and deal with that. So to kind of avoid having that feeling, you're like, let me just take care of these things now so I know that will not happen down the road.
Yeah. It probably sounds a bit much. I know that I'm type A that way.
I mean, I would just say that sounds like you're planning things out, which isn't necessarily bad or anything. It just sounds like you plan, you can kind of foresee, or maybe it's like you know yourself, maybe a little bit better. It's like you know yourself, you know what's going to happen, and you're like, let me just do things the way I know will make me work better.
Yes. I think for the most part, it's really helpful. Where it maybe translates into something negative is I'm obviously an anxious person. So that fear of like, oh, I'm going to be stressed out if I don't do X, Y, Z in situations where I can't control it. So where I can't plan for it, then I just think, okay, I'm going to be anxious. Like I think I talked to you about this. I did therapy as lockdowns were ending, I was sure that I was going to start having my anxiety episodes or like panic attacks because I had social anxiety, and coming out from lockdown and meeting up with friends, even that I was like, okay, I'm not ready for that. And it's because in those environments, it's just, I can't plan for it, right? It's an unknown and it gives me anxiety. My therapist actually gave me homework. She was like, you and Azim, my husband, need to go on a date, go to a restaurant, and don't look at the menu beforehand. Let's start small. Just don't look at the menu online before you go. And I was like, bitch, you're crazy. Are you kidding me? Of course I need to look at the menu. I need to make sure that I'm making all the right choices so Azim and I have optimum like spread across the different appetizers, entrees, and desserts, so we each get this, and I know that we're all trying whatever. Yeah, no, I couldn't even let go of control for that. So I think that's where that type A planning gets me into a little bit of trouble. But going back to the topic, I think that for the most part, it does help me to be motivated by, just knowing myself, knowing what's going to help me just be in a steady state. One thing you mentioned, you talked about like putting things off for entertainment. Yeah. I think I recognized after I started working, especially when we were going into the office, I realized, I only have a set number of hours in a day that are just mine. Like if I'm commuting, then sitting in the office, then coming home, and I need to go to bed by a certain time, I really only have a couple of hours to myself. And if I watch like a 1-hour show, that's an entire hour of my very limited free time gone. I don't necessarily feel good after that. Like sometimes you need like a Netflix binge day. Like sometimes that's just exactly what you need. But if it's the same thing like every single day, there are some shows where I know I would just be so exhausted and come home from work and I'd watch them and I couldn't even tell you the plot line of them. I wouldn't even be able to tell you what happened. I realized that it didn't feel good. Like, wow, I have such limited time. Why am I fucking it up by like scrolling on Instagram or watching a show when I could be doing something that really helps that part of me, feeds my creative side. And I think starting a blog, keeping to a workout routine, writing in my journal, things like that always left me feeling good. If I spent hours doing those things, I'd never come away from it being like, oh, I wish I had spent that time doing something else. It was just sort of like when I realized I only have a limited number of hours in my day, something's got to go. Unfortunately, it can't be work. I would love if it could, but it can't. So I've got to change something. So really early on in my mid-20s, I kind of just changed that.
Wait, so was that a specific point where you just like something clicked and you changed that? Or was that like a gradual understanding of your time and what you could or could not do if you spent time binging shows?
Yeah, I think I just meant more around like when I realized it was work specifically that was making me so tired. I'd come home and I'd just like procrastinate, I guess, on doing something good for me. And I was realizing, oh, I'm spending my time mindlessly numbing my brain with watching shows and stuff. Yeah, I was sort of more just like an instant click.
Interesting. So then I guess my curiosity goes a little bit even further though, because would you say, did you learn that all on your own? Were there influences from home life, I guess, that kind of got you to where you were? For you to say that, like how I can kind of look back and I can kind of, I have some suspicions of how I became the way I am based off of how I grew up. Is that the same for you as somebody who doesn't really procrastinate anymore?
I don't think I ever really procrastinated. I think that brief blip when I started work, that was actually like the outlier for me when I realized like, oh, I'm doing this and it's making me feel shitty. I need to change my mindset here. But growing up, no, I don't think, I guess I could say I had a different experience than you in that I did have a benchmark for knowing like, okay, what you did is good. Like I did get that validation. Like my parents annoyingly like framed every single award, like literally even like participation award up on their wall. They still have it. there's the ugliest picture of a cat that I drew in like kindergarten that they still have up on the wall because they think like framed. Like, guys, you gotta come on. It's okay. I'm 32. This can go.
Can you put that up on Instagram?
But maybe.
Think about it.
Maybe I will. Yeah, I think I did have that validation and I had that benchmark for knowing what was my best work and feeling good about it. So, yeah, I think maybe also seeing my mom just be very organized in terms of, you know, if she was hosting parties and stuff at her place, she'd get everything organized and set out ahead of time. Maybe subconsciously seeing that has influenced me. But I think it is just knowing myself and being self-aware. And yeah, because early on, like I never pulled an all-nighter in university, not once.
Wow.
There's just no way. I just knew that I needed sleep to function. And I liked blocking time into my calendar to be like, okay, I'm going to study for this test a month in advance, and here's how I'm going to do it. And these are the chapters I'm going to focus on. Even now, I time block, like, this is when I'm going to study for French. And this is when I'm going to do some social stuff for our podcast. And yeah, I think it's just my type A personality. I've got some Virgo in my birth chart.
I would agree. That sounds like you. I do want to mention, though, that when you said the blip, where you said, oh, you know, you weren't really doing things well. You were coming home from work and getting on shows and whatnot, and you just can't even remember some of the things. I do want to kind of add, though, that when I talked about procrastination, where it's like I'm holding off doing something and instead I'm doing something that I want, which would be something like, let's use Netflix as an example. Even though that was the quote unquote better alternative to doing the actual task that I want to do, it didn't necessarily feel great to procrastinate either. It wasn't like because I didn't want to do something that I did something where it felt good. It was something that I'd rather do. But at the same time, it wasn't like after watching all those shows that I felt good about myself. There was still a bit of this like negative emotional feeling, or at the end of the night, I'm like, I can't believe I actually just spent a couple hours watching something that didn't really help me. And I'll sometimes even say to myself, okay, well, maybe tomorrow will be different. And then I go to sleep. And then the next day, I repeat the same thing. And so I remember even one time when you and I used to work on the same team. I can't remember, this was maybe earlier in terms of how we knew each other. I remember there's one day you asked me like, oh, so Danny, what do you do outside of work? And I remember I told you, I was like, oh, you know, after work, I sometimes, you know, do groceries, I make food and kind of watch shows. And when I remember that moment, though, I think I was a bit embarrassed that that's all I did. I don't think I ever said that to you or even at the time, but I was like, oh, you know what? That's kind of all I do. I don't really do anything else. Even though I would have ideas of things to do, I don't think I really connected the fact that I was just kind of procrastinating on those things. That's something now I can think about it and I understand it through therapy work and stuff. But at the time, there was something that felt embarrassing for me to say that to you. I was like, I hope she doesn't see through that and go, oh, that's all he does. I'm just bringing that up because I remember like it wasn't exactly like it was great to be doing that. I think procrastination, even if there are studies that say, oh, people like to kind of wait till the last minute, they feel more creative, they're more like their energy goes into it and they're extra focused in that moment. I would kind of question like, does that feel good for that person? Even if their work itself, the result is good, how is that person dealing with themselves internally when that's happening? I'm curious about that. And I would kind of question
me too.
how that really is. And obviously, yeah, I'm sure for work, if the results are great, I'm sure for work, that's kind of what's important. But given this podcast, given the stuff we do with therapy, I'm curious about that human internal portion, like what's happening there. And is it actually as great as the work results that these studies are talking about?
Yeah, me too. Also, I want to note that obviously I would never judge you for saying I'm going home and I'm watching shows because I think that's all of us at one point or another. And there's nothing wrong with that. But if, like you said, there is something that you want to be doing that would be more fulfilling for you, then yeah, I would be that friend that's giving you the gentle reminder of like, hey, you had that dream that you wanted to pursue, and I think you should try it because I think you're going to be awesome at it.
Yeah, you did do that actually. You kind of gave me a deadline, but I actually think you gave me a deadline, I think, one time. And I remember I kind of like internally freaked out a bit. I was like, oh crap, it's a deadline now. And I know what's going to happen with the deadline. But I think you forgot about it. So it never happened.
No, I didn't forget. I knew. Okay, so yeah. So Danny told me, yeah, that he watched shows or like whatever. And like I said, there's no judgment. It's a judgment-free zone. But then at another point, he did tell me that he had a dream of maybe, you know, making a YouTube channel or
I did, yeah.
Something like that. That's when I was like, oh, really? I think you'd be really good at that. And that's when I became the annoying friend that would bring it up every once in a while. And then as we talked and became closer, I gave you the deadline. I said this time next year, you're going to have something. And look, you have a podcast. You did it.
I did. But does come with help. So, no, a bit of a caveat to that, I think. But I'm okay with that.
Question for you, a little behind the scenes here. When it comes to podcast stuff, like editing our episodes, learning how to put them together, all the research that went into starting this, did you ever find yourself procrastinating on any of that?
I would say rarely.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually have thought about why that's the case. Because I thought about it. I was like, you know, this whole podcast process, something about it feels a bit different than, I guess, other tasks that have procrastinated on. I don't know if it's because, and I'm not really 100% sure about it, but you know, this is Danny's theory on this so far, is that this is something that's 100% personal that didn't actually involve someone, like, I guess with school and work, it's kind of like someone kind of giving you tasks to do. Whereas this one there's none of that. It's 100% like, oh, I want to do this thing. I guess originally before you kind of came on board, it was definitely I procrastinated on it. But that once it got going, I think that procrastination portion really isn't there. And I think it has to do a bit with the fact that it's just something that I want to do. But I needed that to get over that hurdle of getting things started. And so I think that's where that difference is. And I think that's something where I would like to kind of go into that one day where we talk about like the idea that doing things you want to do actually is very different feeling internally compared to what you think you need to do or should do because of what somebody else said or provided the idea for. It's very different than if someone themselves were like, oh, I want to do this and I'm working towards it. I think that's a bit different feeling wise.
Let's save that for our people-pleasing episode. I think bringing up expectations and shoulds will be very relevant for that conversation.
We'll save it for that one. Okay. I think that was a good one. I don't know if there's anything else
Yeah. Thanks so much for sharing.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing your portion because that's something interesting to grasp. Anything you want to add at the end or?
That's enough, Cream Puff.
All right. Then that's it. We'll see everyone next time. Have a good week. Bye.
Bye.